The people who work hardest to prove they won are often the ones most afraid someone else might show the truth. Ryan Mercer stood beneath a canopy of crystal lights and believed this was the night everyone would remember. The ballroom of the Harbor Crown Hotel overlooked the Miami waterfront, where luxury yachts rested across dark water, reflecting thousands of city lights. Inside, the celebration sparkled with effortless wealth. Fresh white orchids lined the entrance. A live jazz ensemble played near the grand staircase. Servers moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with champagne glasses that shimmered beneath chandeliers the size of small cars. Every detail had been carefully chosen. Every detail had been designed to tell a story. Ryan's story. Guests arrived dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns. Influential business owners shook hands near the bar. Social media personalities posed for photographs beside a custom engagement display decorated with hundreds of white roses. Conversations filled the room with admiration and curiosity. Ryan enjoyed every second of it. Standing at the center of the ballroom was exactly where he wanted to be. Beside him stood Sophie Collins, his fiancée. Tall, elegant, and instantly recognizable from fashion campaigns and magazine covers. Sophie attracted attention the moment she entered any room. Tonight was no exception. Photographers constantly asked for another picture. Guests complimented her appearance. People whispered about how perfect they looked together. Ryan smiled each time he heard it. That was the point. This evening was not simply an engagement celebration. It was a statement, a public declaration that he had upgraded every part of his life. Sophie rested a hand lightly on his arm as another group approached to offer congratulations. Ryan thanked them while glancing around the ballroom. He noticed the approving looks, the subtle envy, the admiration. Everything felt exactly as he imagined. Then one guest laughed and said, "Ryan, you always land on your feet. Look at this place. Look at her. You are living the dream." Several people nearby nodded. Ryan raised his glass. Life has a way of rewarding the right decisions. More laughter followed. Sophie smiled politely. The comment sounded harmless enough. Yet beneath the surface, everyone understood what remained unspoken. There had once been someone else. Danielle Brooks, his former wife. The woman who had disappeared from his life years earlier. Ryan rarely mentioned her anymore. In his version of events, she belonged to another chapter. A chapter already closed and forgotten. Across the ballroom, conversations drifted from business to relationships to success stories. Occasionally Danielle's name surfaced, usually for only a moment. Someone would ask what happened to her. Someone else would shrug. Then attention would return to Ryan and Sophie. The present always seemed more interesting than the past, or so Ryan believed. As the evening continued, he moved confidently through the crowd, introducing Sophie to investors, executives, and public figures. Everywhere they went, people praised them as the perfect couple. The compliments accumulated like trophies. Yet despite the flawless atmosphere, a strange feeling lingered just beneath Ryan's confidence. A small restlessness he could not quite explain. Every so often, his eyes drifted toward the ballroom entrance, as though he were expecting something, or someone. Outside, the Miami skyline glowed against the warm night sky. Luxury cars continued arriving beneath the covered entrance. Guests stepped onto red carpet runners while photographers captured every arrival. Inside, the engagement celebration grew louder. The music swelled. The laughter deepened. Ryan lifted his glass once more and looked around the room. This was supposed to be his victory lap. The night he proved to everyone how successful he had become. What he did not know was that before the evening ended, the story everyone remembered would have nothing to do with him. By the time the evening reached its second hour, the engagement celebration had transformed into exactly the kind of event Ryan Mercer loved. Every corner of the ballroom seemed filled with admiration. Music drifted through the air from the jazz ensemble near the waterfront windows. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the chandeliers. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with expensive perfume and ocean air carried in each time the entrance doors opened. Guests moved between conversation circles, while photographers continued capturing images for social media and local lifestyle magazines. At the center of it all stood Ryan and Sophie Collins. Wherever they went, attention followed. Sophie's presence seemed almost effortless. She smiled for photographs, greeted guests with practiced warmth, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. The room responded exactly as Ryan had hoped. More than once, he overheard people describing them as the perfect couple. One guest compared them to a celebrity power pair. Another commented that Sophie looked like she belonged on the cover of a luxury wedding magazine. Ryan accepted every compliment with quiet satisfaction. It was not enough for him to be successful. He wanted everyone else to see it too. Near the waterfront terrace, a group of investors gathered around him. One of them raised a glass and laughed. "Ryan, I have to say, you outdid yourself. This engagement party feels like a movie premiere." The group chuckled. Ryan glanced toward Sophie, who was speaking with several guests nearby. "She deserves something special," he replied. "Not everyone gets a second chance to build the life they really want." Several heads nodded in agreement. The statement lingered in the air. Once again, nobody directly mentioned Danielle Brooks, but her absence seemed quietly woven into the conversation. Ryan noticed it. He enjoyed it. Every compliment directed towards Sophie felt like confirmation that he had chosen correctly. Across the ballroom, Sophie was receiving similar praise. A woman from a fashion publication admired her engagement ring. Another guest asked about wedding plans. Someone else complimented her latest magazine campaign. Sophie handled the attention gracefully, but unlike Ryan, she did not appear to feed on it. There were moments when she seemed almost uncomfortable with the constant comparisons people made between herself and a woman she had never met. Yet Ryan never noticed. His focus remained fixed on the image being created around them. As the evening continued, a giant display screen near the ballroom stage began showing photographs from Ryan and Sophie's relationship. Pictures from beach vacations, charity galas, weekend trips aboard private yachts, elegant dinners beneath city skylines. Guests gathered to watch. Smiles spread across the room. Ryan stood nearby, observing their reactions with obvious pride. Every image reinforced the same message: success, beauty, status, achievement. It was the story he wanted everyone to believe. Then an older businessman standing near the display glanced at one photograph and said, "You certainly moved on fast after your divorce." The comment was not hostile, merely observational. Yet for the first time all evening, Ryan's smile tightened slightly. "Life moves forward," he answered. The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it does." Before Ryan could respond, another guest quickly changed the subject, and the conversation continued. Still, something about the exchange lingered. Not because it challenged him, because it reminded him that no matter how polished the present appeared, the past had not completely disappeared. Outside the ballroom windows, the dark waters of Biscayne Bay reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. Inside, laughter continued. Music swelled. Cameras flashed. Everything remained beautiful. Everything remained impressive. Yet somewhere beyond the hotel entrance, a different story was quietly moving closer. Ryan continued shaking hands and accepting congratulations, completely unaware that the image he spent months constructing was only moments away from facing a reality far more powerful than appearances. As the celebration moved deeper into the evening, the atmosphere inside the Harbor Crown Hotel became even more polished and theatrical. The ballroom glowed beneath layers of golden light, while reflections from the bay shimmered across the towering windows. Guests circulated between tables, lounges, and terrace doors, carrying drinks and conversations from one corner of the room to another. Everywhere Ryan Mercer walked, people greeted him with congratulations. He accepted every compliment with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times. Near the center of the ballroom, a small group gathered around one of the oversized engagement displays. White roses climbed around illuminated photographs of Ryan and Sophie Collins. Several guests admired the images while discussing wedding venues and travel plans. Ryan joined them with a smile. "Looks like the wedding of the year already," one guest joked. Laughter followed. Sophie smiled politely, though Ryan seemed to enjoy the attention far more than she did. Another guest lifted a champagne glass and said, "You really found someone extraordinary." Ryan glanced toward Sophie. "I did." The response came quickly. Too quickly, as though he wanted everyone nearby to hear it. The conversation continued for several minutes before a woman from one of Ryan's former business circles asked an innocent question. "Whatever happened to Danielle?" The group grew slightly quieter. Not silent, just attentive. Ryan's smile remained in place. "Danielle?" He gave a casual shrug. "That chapter ended a long time ago." The woman nodded. I have not heard anything about her in years. Ryan swirled the drink in his glass. Most people have not. A few guests exchanged glances. Ryan noticed and continued. Some people move forward. Some people stay stuck. Life has a way of sorting itself out. Several people laughed softly. Not because the comment was especially funny, but because social gatherings often reward confidence regardless of substance. Ryan interpreted the reaction as agreement. Across the room, Sophie turned slightly when she heard Danielle's name mentioned. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She never joined the conversation. She never encouraged it. Yet she listened. One guest leaned closer to Ryan. Do you ever wonder where she ended up? Ryan took a sip from his glass before answering. Honestly, not really. More laughter followed. I wish her well, but I have my future now. He gestured toward Sophie. And I am exactly where I want to be. The group nodded. The statement sounded convincing. On the surface, it even appeared true. Yet there was something unusual about the way Ryan kept returning to the subject. Nobody else seemed particularly interested in Danielle anymore. Yet each time her name surfaced, Ryan felt compelled to reinforce the same narrative. He had moved on. He had upgraded his life. He had won. Near the terrace entrance, an older woman who had known both Ryan and Danielle years earlier observed the exchange from a distance. She said nothing. She simply watched. Experience had taught her that people who truly move on rarely spend much time talking about the people they left behind. The evening continued. Music flowed through the ballroom. Servers refreshed drinks. Guests filled the dance floor near the stage. Everything appeared flawless. Yet beneath the celebration, a subtle shift was beginning. Danielle's name had entered the room. Once spoken, it lingered. Not loudly, not dramatically, like a distant memory quietly taking its place among the decorations and champagne glasses. Ryan remained unaware of the effect. He continued greeting guests and accepting admiration. He believed the past had become irrelevant. He believed tonight belonged entirely to him. But beyond the glowing entrance doors of the Harbor Crown Hotel, a black luxury vehicle had just turned into the waterfront driveway. And with it came a future Ryan never saw coming. Outside the Harbor Crown Hotel, the warm Miami night carried the scent of salt water and tropical air across the waterfront. Luxury vehicles continued arriving beneath the illuminated entrance, while photographers waited for notable guests to step onto the red carpet. Inside the ballroom, music and laughter flowed without interruption. Ryan Mercer remained surrounded by admiration, completely unaware that the woman many believed had disappeared from the story was living a life none of them had imagined. 3 years earlier, when the divorce papers were finalized, Danielle Brooks left the courthouse carrying little more than a handbag and a silence she could not yet understand. The future felt uncertain. Every familiar routine had been replaced by questions. Friends slowly drifted away. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became shorter. People often disappear when they no longer know where to place you in their version of success. Danielle discovered that truth quickly. Yet she also discovered something else. Freedom sometimes arrives disguised as loss. The first year after the divorce was not glamorous. There were no luxury events, no celebrations, no public victories. Most mornings began before sunrise in a small apartment overlooking a busy Miami street. Delivery trucks rattled below her windows before daylight arrived. The aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe drifted upward through the humid morning air. Danielle would sit at a small kitchen table reviewing project proposals while the city slowly woke around her. She accepted consulting work. She enrolled in professional certification programs. She spent weekends attending networking events where nobody recognized her name. One step at a time, she rebuilt. Not because she wanted revenge, because she refused to disappear. Months became years. The woman who once measured her value through a marriage slowly transformed into someone who understood her own worth. Opportunities expanded. Professional relationships grew stronger. New doors opened. More importantly, Danielle learned to enjoy her own company. She stopped asking why certain things happened and started focusing on what she could build next. One afternoon, while waiting for a delayed flight in an airport executive lounge, her life quietly changed again. She remembered the sound of rolling luggage crossing polished floors, the distant announcements echoing through the terminal, travelers checking phones while watching departure screens. Danielle sat near a large window reviewing documents when a stranger asked whether the empty seat beside her was available. She looked up. The man carried himself with effortless confidence. Not loud confidence. The kind that never needed attention. His name was James Whitmore. Their first conversation lasted less than 15 minutes. Mostly about travel, business, and favorite cities. Yet something about it felt different. There were no rehearsed lines. No attempts to impress. No performances. Over the following months their paths crossed repeatedly. Sometimes by coincidence. Sometimes intentionally. Each conversation became slightly longer than the last. What stood out most was what James never asked. He never asked about her divorce. Never asked what went wrong. Never treated her past like a defining characteristic. Instead, he asked about her goals. Her ideas. Her plans. He listened carefully when she spoke. In a world filled with people eager to talk about themselves, that quality felt surprisingly rare. As time passed, trust developed naturally. Then affection. Then something deeper. Danielle never rushed it. Neither did James. Their relationship grew the same way strong foundations are built. Quietly. Consistently. Without the need for an audience. Back inside the Harbor Crown Hotel, the engagement celebration continued beneath sparkling lights and polished smiles. Guests admired Ryan's version of success while discussing a future they assumed they understood. Yet beyond the ballroom walls existed another reality entirely. One built through patience, resilience, and genuine connection. A reality that was moving closer with every passing minute. And before the night ended, everyone inside that ballroom would finally see it. The black luxury vehicle rolled smoothly beneath the illuminated entrance canopy while valet attendants stepped forward in practiced coordination. The waterfront breeze carried across polished stone walkways lined with decorative lanterns and tropical flowers. Inside the vehicle, Danielle Brooks rested one hand gently across her growing belly and watched the lights of the Harbor Crown Hotel shimmer through the window. The celebration taking place inside was no secret. Social media posts had already spread photographs throughout the evening. Smiling guests. Engagement displays. Ryan Mercer standing proudly beside Sophie Collins. Danielle had seen enough to understand exactly what kind of event it was. Yet she felt no anger. No jealousy. Only a quiet sense of distance from a life that no longer belonged to her. Beside her sat James Whitmore. His expression remained calm as he adjusted the cuff of his jacket. He carried himself with the same effortless composure he had shown since the day they met. There was never a need for performance. Never a need to dominate a room. Confidence followed him naturally because it was rooted in substance rather than appearance. Danielle glanced toward him and smiled. "You know we could still leave." James smiled back. "Do you want to?" Danielle considered the question for a moment before shaking her head. "No." James nodded once. "Then we are exactly where we should be." The valet opened the door. Warm night air entered the vehicle. Danielle stepped out carefully, her elegant navy gown flowing softly around her. The design was sophisticated without being dramatic. She had not chosen it to impress anyone. She had chosen it because it made her feel comfortable and confident. As she stood beneath the entrance lights, several nearby guests looked in her direction. At first there was no recognition. Then curiosity. Then subtle surprise. Danielle looked radiant. Not because of expensive jewelry or designer labels. Because peace has a way of changing a person's presence. James stepped out moments later. His dark suit was tailored perfectly, though nothing about his appearance seemed intentionally flashy. Together they began walking toward the entrance. A hotel manager standing near the doors immediately recognized him. His posture straightened. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." James offered a polite nod. "Good evening." Danielle noticed the reaction but thought little of it. She had witnessed similar interactions many times. Airports, conferences, charity events. Business leaders often recognized James before introducing themselves. Yet James never encouraged the attention. Inside the hotel lobby, marble floors reflected the glow of grand chandeliers suspended several stories overhead. Guests moved between elevators and reception areas, while distant music drifted from the ballroom. As Danielle and James crossed the lobby, another recognition occurred. Then another. A hospitality executive stopped to greet James warmly. A regional business owner approached to shake his hand. A board member from a major transportation company smiled and welcomed him personally. None of these interactions lasted long. Yet each one revealed the same pattern. People who occupied influential positions treated James with extraordinary respect. Danielle could feel curious glances following them as they approached the ballroom entrance. The large doors stood partially open. Beyond them, laughter, music, and celebration continued uninterrupted. For now, Danielle paused just outside. Through the opening, she could see crystal lights, elegantly dressed guests, and the glittering waterfront beyond the windows. Somewhere inside stood Ryan Mercer, convinced the evening belonged entirely to him. James looked toward her. Ready? Danielle exhaled slowly and rested her hand once more across her belly. A small smile touched her lips. Not because she wanted anyone's attention, because she finally understood something she had spent years learning. Happiness becomes much easier when it is no longer dependent on proving anything to anyone. Ready, she said softly. Together they stepped toward the ballroom doors. And inside, without realizing it, hundreds of people were only moments away from witnessing the first surprise of the evening. The ballroom doors opened without fanfare. No announcement echoed through the speakers. No spotlight swung toward the entrance. Yet within seconds, something changed. It began with a few scattered glances from guests standing nearest the doorway. Then conversation slowed. Heads turned. The subtle ripple moved through the room like a breeze crossing still water. Danielle Brooks stepped inside beside James Whitmore. The golden ballroom light reflected softly against her navy gown as she walked with measured confidence. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. One hand rested naturally against her growing belly while the other remained at her side. The simple gesture carried more impact than any dramatic entrance ever could. Several guests blinked in surprise. Others exchanged quick looks. For a moment, many struggled to reconcile the woman before them with the image they remembered from years earlier. Danielle looked different, not because of expensive clothing or elaborate styling. She looked different because she looked at peace. Near the center of the ballroom, a woman who had known Ryan and Danielle during their marriage nearly dropped her glass. "Is that Danielle?" she whispered. Her companion followed her gaze and immediately froze. Within moments, whispers spread through nearby groups. Names traveled quietly between tables. Curiosity grew. Across the room, Ryan Mercer was in the middle of a conversation when he noticed people looking past him. At first, he assumed another notable guest had arrived. Then he saw where their attention was directed. His smile disappeared. For a brief second, the ballroom seemed strangely silent. Danielle, standing only 50 feet away. Ryan stared. The last time he had seen her, she was leaving a chapter of her life behind. The woman entering the ballroom tonight appeared completely different. Sophie's expression shifted as she followed Ryan's gaze. "That is Danielle?" she asked softly. Ryan nodded without taking his eyes off the entrance. Then he noticed something else. Danielle's hand resting across her belly. The realization landed immediately. Sophie noticed it too. Around them, several guests quietly reached the same conclusion. Surprise deepened into astonishment. The atmosphere changed again, not because Danielle was pregnant, because she looked genuinely happy. There was no trace of bitterness, no sign of someone carrying old wounds into the room. Instead, she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone focused entirely on the future. Danielle continued walking through the ballroom. Guests moved aside naturally. Some greeted her politely. Others simply watched. A few smiled warmly. She acknowledged them with grace, never seeking attention, yet somehow drawing it effortlessly. Ryan felt a knot tighten inside his chest. This was not how he imagined a reunion would look. If he imagined it at all, he expected discomfort, awkwardness, maybe even regret. Instead, Danielle looked like someone arriving at an ordinary social event with nothing to prove. The contrast unsettled him. One of Ryan's business associates leaned toward another and whispered, "She looks incredible." The comment was not intended for Ryan, but he heard it anyway. More guests began turning toward the entrance. More conversations shifted. The engagement celebration that had revolved entirely around Ryan and Sophie only minutes earlier suddenly found a new focal point. Yet the biggest surprise had not even arrived. Most guests remained focused on Danielle. Very few paid attention to the man walking beside her. James moved through the ballroom with quiet ease. No grand introductions. No attempts to attract notice. Yet several individuals near the back immediately recognized him. A transportation executive straightened in surprise. A private equity partner narrowed his eyes. A hospitality owner whispered something under his breath before looking again. Recognition was spreading, but slowly, like a match approaching a fuse. Danielle and James stopped near one of the waterfront windows overlooking the bay. City lights shimmered across the dark water beyond the glass. For a brief moment, they stood together enjoying the view while the ballroom continued adjusting to their presence. Ryan remained frozen where he stood. He believed the shock of seeing Danielle had already disrupted the evening enough. What he did not realize was that the room was only beginning to understand who had just walked through those doors. For several minutes, the ballroom existed in a strange state of divided attention. Officially, the engagement celebration continued exactly as planned. Music played, drinks circulated, guests exchanged smiles and congratulations. Yet beneath the surface, curiosity had taken hold. More and more people found themselves looking toward the waterfront windows where Danielle Brooks stood beside the man few had fully recognized. The realization began with a transportation executive from Atlanta. He stared at James Whitmore for several seconds before excusing himself from a conversation and walking directly across the room. When he reached James, his expression transformed immediately. "Mr. Whitmore," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It is good to see you again." James shook his hand with a polite smile. The interaction lasted less than a minute, yet dozens of nearby guests witnessed it. Conversation slowed. Eyes followed the exchange. Then another person approached. This time it was the chief executive of a regional airline company, then a hotel investor, then a logistics entrepreneur. One after another, influential people crossed the ballroom to greet James personally. Danielle noticed the growing attention but remained calm. She had seen similar reactions before. James never encouraged them. He never sought the spotlight. Yet respect seemed to follow him wherever he went. Across the room, Ryan Mercer watched the pattern develop. His uneasiness deepened. At first he assumed James was simply a successful businessman. Miami was full of successful business people. But successful business people did not attract this level of recognition. Sophie quietly observed the same thing. "Who exactly is he?" she asked. Ryan shook his head. "I am not sure." A few feet away, one guest finally supplied the answer. "You seriously do not know?" he asked. Ryan turned toward him. The man looked surprised. "That is James Whitmore." Ryan waited for the name to mean something. The guest continued. "Whitmore Aerospace Holdings." Ryan's expression changed instantly. Around them, several people overheard the conversation and stopped talking. The guest lowered his voice slightly. "Private aviation, aircraft manufacturing, international logistics. He owns one of the largest aviation groups in the country." Sophie blinked. "That James Whitmore." "The same one." The information spread through the ballroom with remarkable speed. Recognition turned into astonishment. Guests who had only moments earlier focused on Danielle now began paying attention to the man standing beside her. Several people discreetly searched his name on their phones. Others exchanged shocked looks after confirming what they found. James Whitmore was not simply wealthy. He was one of the most influential figures in the aviation industry. The scale of his business empire stretched far beyond anything most people in the room had imagined. Yet the most surprising detail was not his success. It was the fact that he appeared entirely uninterested in displaying it. While others built their identities around status, James seemed perfectly comfortable standing quietly beside Danielle near the window. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Ryan felt the atmosphere shifting around him. Earlier in the evening, guests had gathered around him and Sophie. They admired the photographs, the engagement display, the image of success. Now those same guests were glancing toward another couple entirely. A woman standing nearby whispered, "They look happy." Another nodded, genuinely happy. The observation spread because it felt true. Danielle and James were not performing for anyone. They were simply enjoying each other's company. Near the terrace doors, a respected investor approached Danielle and offered congratulations. She thanked him politely. Another guest complimented her. Then another. Ryan watched as attention slowly migrated across the ballroom. Not through effort, not through strategy, through authenticity. For the first time all evening, he no longer felt like the most important person in the room. Meanwhile, Danielle remained completely unaware of the effect she was having. She stood beside James overlooking the bay while city lights danced across the water beyond the glass. The future she had built through patience and resilience was finally visible to everyone around her. And yet the greatest surprise of the evening had not been revealed. Because while guests were still processing who James Whitmore was, they had not yet discovered the deeper reason Danielle's quiet smile seemed brighter than anyone could explain. The engagement celebration continued, but it no longer felt like the same event. The center of gravity inside the ballroom had shifted. Guests still smiled for photographs. Music still floated through the air. Servers still carried silver trays between clusters of conversations. Yet attention kept drifting toward Danielle Brooks and James Whitmore. The more people learned about James, the more fascinated they became. Across the room, Ryan Mercer felt it happening one conversation at a time. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle turn of a head. The admiration he had spent the evening collecting seemed to be slipping quietly toward someone else. Near the waterfront windows, Danielle accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. She thanked him warmly before resting one hand across her belly once again. The gesture was simple, natural, yet it drew the attention of several guests nearby. An older woman approached with a kind smile. "Congratulations," she said gently. Danielle smiled back. "Thank you." The woman glanced toward James and then back toward Danielle. "You must be excited." Danielle's expression softened immediately. There was a warmth in her eyes that had been absent during the years after her divorce. "Very excited," she replied. The woman nodded and continued on her way. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet 2 nearby guests overheard it. Then 4 more. Then 8. Curiosity began spreading through the ballroom again. Earlier in the evening, guests had been surprised to see Danielle. Then they were shocked to discover who stood beside her. Now a third realization was slowly taking shape. Near the center of the room, a hospitality executive who knew James through industry events joined a conversation already filled with speculation. Someone finally asked the question everyone was wondering. "Are they together?" The executive laughed softly. "Together? They are engaged." Several people blinked. "Engaged?" "Absolutely." He smiled. "And if the rumors are true, they are preparing for a very busy year." The comment immediately attracted attention. "Busy how?" someone asked. The executive glanced toward Danielle and lowered his voice slightly, though not enough to prevent nearby listeners from hearing. "They are expecting their first child." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. The kind that arrives when information suddenly rearranges everything people thought they understood. Within minutes, the news moved across the ballroom. Conversations stopped and restarted. Guests exchanged astonished looks. The revelation carried a weight greater than wealth or status. James Whitmore was impressive. His aviation empire was impressive. But this was different. This was a future, a family, a life being built. Across the room, Ryan overheard the news almost accidentally. 2 guests standing nearby discussed it while examining photographs on their phones. At first he assumed he misunderstood. Then he heard it repeated again and again. The realization settled heavily inside him. Danielle was not simply happy. She was creating an entirely new chapter. Sophie noticed the change in his expression. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Ryan looked toward Danielle and James. For a moment, he could not answer. Across the ballroom, Danielle and James stood together near the windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. Neither appeared aware of the effect their presence was having. James leaned slightly closer as they spoke. Danielle laughed softly at something he said. It was a simple moment. Genuine. Unrehearsed. No photographers gathered around them. No audience was required. Yet somehow it carried more authenticity than anything else that had happened all evening. Guests noticed that too. A woman standing nearby whispered to her husband, "Look at them." He followed her gaze. "They seem happy." "Not just happy," she said. "Certain." That single word captured what everyone was beginning to see. Danielle no longer looked like someone recovering from a painful past. She looked like someone walking confidently toward a future she genuinely wanted. The engagement celebration had started as a showcase of what Ryan believed he gained. Now it had become something entirely different. Because standing beneath the glow of the ballroom lights was living proof that the woman everyone once viewed as the one left behind had built a life far beyond anyone's expectations. And as the evening approached its final hours, Ryan found himself staring at a future he could never be part of. As the evening approached its final hour, the energy inside the Harbor Crown Hotel felt completely different from the celebration Ryan Mercer had envisioned. The ballroom remained beautiful. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the room with warm gold light. Music continued drifting through the air. Guests still smiled and exchanged pleasantries. Yet beneath the polished surface, the story everyone would remember had already changed. Ryan stood near the engagement display surrounded by photographs meant to symbolize his future. Across the room stood Danielle Brooks, quietly living hers. The contrast could not have been clearer. Near the waterfront windows, several guests gathered around Danielle and James Whitmore before eventually drifting away one by one. Some offered congratulations. Others spoke about business, travel, or family. Every interaction felt natural. Nothing appeared staged. Nothing required effort. Danielle listened more than she spoke. James remained gracious and attentive. Together, they created the kind of presence that could not be manufactured because it came from genuine contentment rather than performance. Outside the windows, Miami sparkled beneath the night sky. Reflections danced across Biscayne Bay, while distant boats moved through the darkness. Danielle paused to admire the view. Her hand rested gently across her belly as she watched the city lights. James stepped beside her. "Long evening," he said with a smile. Danielle laughed softly. "Longer than I expected. Any regrets about coming?" She thought about the question for a moment. Then she shook her head. "None." James nodded. Neither felt the need to say more. Some answers become obvious through experience. Across the ballroom, Ryan watched them from a distance. Earlier in the evening, he believed success looked like admiration, attention, and envy. Yet standing there now, he began to notice something different. The people surrounding Danielle and James were not impressed merely because of wealth. They were drawn to something deeper: stability, respect, authentic happiness, qualities that could not be rented for an evening or displayed in photographs. Sophie followed his gaze. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, she asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Ryan forced a small smile. Of course. But even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. The truth was difficult to ignore. Years earlier, he believed leaving Danielle would move him closer to the life he wanted. Standing in the ballroom now, he realized he had never truly understood what she would become. More importantly, he had never understood what he had lost. Not because Danielle found someone influential. Not because she arrived with a billionaire. Those details mattered far less than people assumed. What mattered was the woman she had become after everything ended. Stronger, calmer, happier, entirely her own. Near midnight, guests began departing. Conversations slowly faded. Valet attendants prepared vehicles outside. Staff members quietly cleared empty glasses and folded in used place settings. The celebration was ending. Danielle and James gathered their belongings and made their way toward the exit. Along the way, several guests stopped to wish them well. Others offered congratulations for the future ahead. Danielle thanked each person warmly. When they reached the entrance, she paused for one final glance across the ballroom. Not toward Ryan specifically, not toward the engagement display, simply toward the room itself. A room that had once represented an old chapter of her life. Tonight it represented something different. Closure. James opened the door, and the warm Miami night greeted them once more. Together they stepped outside beneath the glow of the waterfront lights. Their vehicle waited at the curb. As they drove away, the city stretched before them, filled with possibilities yet to be written. Inside the hotel, Ryan remained standing near the center of the ballroom long after many guests had left. The music had softened. The lights seemed dimmer. Around him stood evidence of a celebration designed to showcase victory. Yet the lesson he carried home had nothing to do with winning. Danielle never returned to prove anyone wrong. She never demanded recognition. She never sought revenge. She simply built a better life and kept walking forward. And as Ryan watched the final taillights disappear into the Miami night, he finally understood that the future he once took for granted now belonged to someone else.